others survive. Their faith was very strong, and they had to be very strong in addition. This was a lifelong mission for them. It wasn't a 2-year mission and then you go home. And many of these women had left very nice homes in the Salt Lake area and many comfortable surroundings to come to this very, very difficult place. In fact, I doubt that the St. George area would have been settled unless Brigham Young had called people here on a mission. If people had just come to live here, no one would have stayed. It was much too difficult.
People were asked so much back then, it's almost incomprehensible today to understand what it must have been like. And they gave their all and were sacrificing here, and then they were asked to provide teams, drivers, and wagons to go literally thousands of miles to the east to help more saints to come to the valley. And Erastus finally had to prevail on Brigham Young to maybe hold off down here because too many of the good folks here were being taken out of the community, and there just wasn't enough able-bodied men to go around to get all the work done.
One of the real tender stories about the settlement of St. George is the story of young David H. Cannon and his wife Wilhelmina. Wilhelmina was not happy. She wanted to go home. She would coax her husband, please, let's go home. And he said, I can't go home. I'm on a call. We're called here. We've got to stay. And he and his wife had words over whether they should stay or go. Finally, she said, if you can show me one thing of beauty, I'll stay. And he set about to look out for a thing of beauty. And he searched and finally found a seagull lily flower. And he took the seagull lily home to her and gave her that seagull lily. And she said, okay, I'll stay.
Brigham Young called 309 families to St. George. You want to remember that as the pioneers crossed the plains, they only had, the majority of them, only one change of clothing. And so by the time they got into Salt Lake, they didn't have much to wear. And so it was apparent that there needed to be cotton found, or a place to grow cotton, so that the pioneers would have materials in order to use them to make clothing. One of the ladies had brought a little bit of cotton seed, and so they planted that cotton. As soon as they arrived into the valley, the fields were plowed, it was made available to get water from the river, and they planted the cotton. But of course it took a long time to grow cotton, and as they progressed with the city and as they were trying to build their homes, the temple, the tabernacle, the various buildings throughout the area, they also had to grow their cotton. Sometimes the river would flood, which is normal around here. It would also, we would have hailstorms, of which we're quite noted for in the early spring. There were wild animals, or the animals would stray and take out the fields, and so it made it a real job to be able to grow that cotton. They were successful. Brigham Young decided that he wanted his cotton tested, and so he sent some of it to England and found that it was as good a cotton as any that they had in the United States or had grown in the United States. So he was very happy, and they did ship out a total of 75,000 pounds into the New York area. They got 75 cents a pound for that cotton. Well, in turn, those wagons that took the cotton east also had to bring back the dye, the warp, the oil, and the materials needed in order to make the mill run.
Now, it's interesting to know that when they needed a cotton mill, Brigham Young went to Appleton Milo Harmon, who happens to be my great-grandfather, and he said, Appleton, will you build us a cotton mill? I'll give you $2,000 to you and your sons if you'll build us this mill. So Appleton said, okay, and they built the cotton mill and then helped install the machinery so that they could weave the cotton that they raised into cloth.
Individuals who had joined the church who were familiar with the operation of that equipment were called on missions to St. George to oversee that operation. That whole effort was originally funded by a loan from Brigham Young personally to the tune of $44,000. And probably one of the difficulties in Erastus's and Brigham's relationship really centered around the inability of that endeavor to be financially successful. And as a result, that large loan was never repaid. And Erastus had signed, with many others of the saints here locally, had signed that note to Brigham, owing that money to Brigham Young. And to continue to keep that operation going, they had borrowed an additional $10,000. And these notes were at the rate of 12% interest. And it was difficult. They were able to keep the interest payments up, but ultimately never were able, at least in Brigham's lifetime, to repay those notes.
The cotton is usually planted after the soil reaches 60 degrees for 8 inches down. Now, it depends on your spring. Sometimes we can plant as early as the latter part of March. Sometimes it's into April before it can be planted. It takes the entire summer to get large enough to mature and the bolls form. It has a nice, kind of a yellowish white bloom on it. And then that bloom goes to a boll, and then the boll forms, and it takes it until fall. Sometimes some of the bolls will not be completely formed until almost time for frost. The cotton was used mainly for the weaving. At the mill in Washington, they were able to make canvas. They made the jean material. They made the woolsey linsey. They also made the thread, the crochet thread, and the various things like this. And of course, people needed this for clothing. They had the canvases for their tarps, for their wagons, for their tents. They made quilts, blankets. A variety of clothing items were made from the cotton that was grown. They also would have sent a lot of that cotton into Salt Lake City because those people were as destitute in Salt Lake as they were in St. George. The demise of the cotton was probably the fact that it took them so long in order to get their money, number one. Number two, to get the items that stocked their mill to be able to continue. And it became a crop that took so long to produce that by the time some of them were wiped out, it would almost be too late to start a new crop, because our flooding continues all summer long in this area with the flash floods coming from the Zion area, and of course the area that the Virgin River drains. Why, it would take a long time as they would go, because the floods would come off and on all summer long. Many times they would plant 2 or 3 times with the hail and with the floods coming from the Virgin River. It would wipe out their cotton fields in just a matter of a short day or two, even after they had worked as long and as hard as they had to get it planted and up. It always had to be hoed, cultivated, and to this point, as it would grow and then matured, and they called it white gold. And when it was ready to pick, they would take a large sack. They would tie a string around the top of the sack, and they would tie that string around their waist, and the sack would sit between their legs. And they would go down the rows and put the cotton into the sack until they could no longer drag the cotton. They could pick approximately 150 to 200 pounds to drag it along the row. And so it was a real job. It took them a long time in order to get this cotton up and baled, and the seeds taken out of it, because the seeds all have to be taken out. It was corded, and the seeds taken out before it was put in the bales and ready to go to the looms or to the spinning. They also, at this same time, were trying to raise the silkworms. In 1855, Brigham Young had decided that they needed to grow or try the silkworms in the territory. Now, you know, women are kind of fickle, and they like nice dresses, and the pioneer women were no different. And so his wives, I'm sure, encouraged him to look into the process of growing silk. So he ordered the mulberry trees, and they planted mulberry trees throughout the area. But of course they don't grow very good in Salt Lake City. And so St. George was one of the areas, or Eutaw-Stixie was one of the areas that was chosen also to try and grow the mulberry trees along with the silkworms. He let the mulberry trees get to a pretty good size, and then he ordered the eggs for the growing of the silkworms. The worms, they would spin their silk. They shipped some out. They were paid 5 cents a pound for the silk from the worms. They would get 2.5 miles of silk approximately from one cocoon. The cocoon had to be wet in order to unravel, because otherwise the thread will often break, and they would want that thread into one continuous line. From the silk industry, they done that pretty much until around 1905, and then the state was paying for them to grow the silk, and so about that point in time it almost became too much of a job, and so the silk industry died out. Alfalfa was also introduced into the area, and other items that with their fruit, their orchards, their trees, and their grapevines were large enough by this point in time to start producing. And so they would go pretty much to the fruit and the alfalfa industry. The mines had opened up in the area, Silver Reef, Panaca, Pioche, and the miners that came into the area, of course, had money. They were working in the mines, and they had money, and so they could pay cash right away, of which the people didn't have. Everything that they grew was traded and was done in kind. And so with the influx of the miners, they used a lot of the fruit and the grapes. The wine was made from the grapes. Each of the people that had the grapes, or there were a lot of the men, a lot of the people that brought their winemakers, some made wine. They paid their tithing in wine. It was also shipped to the mining areas. They built a winery in Tokerville, and this was used for the sacramental wine.
Dixie was such a tough mission. The people who came were extraordinary people. They were hard workers. They had been sent to raise cotton, and that was their first goal. But at the same time, they built a temple. They built a tabernacle. They built a courthouse. They built an opera house. They built a cotton mill within the first 15 years of their arrival here. So they didn't have 40-hour weeks. They were working all the time, in addition to providing food for themselves and their families. It's incredible to me how much work had to go into building a town.
The missionaries that were sent here had their cattle and their settlement at Santa Clara. In 1855, 2 of them were taking their cattle from Santa Clara up to Mountain Meadow for grazing, and they lost a cow. Isaac Riddle went looking for the cow, and William Hamlin took the cattle on to Mountain Meadow. Following up the Santa Clara River several miles, he came over the ridge into one of the most beautiful valleys he'd ever seen, with large stands of ponderosa pine on the foothills and spruce. And there in the bottom of that valley, standing in grass up to its belly, was the lost cow. The discovery of that valley was as important as discovering gold, because of the quality of the ponderosa pine that was there. they found the material that they could build homes.